It was just another chilly morning when Mrs. Thompson hurried into the classroom, her worn-out bag slung over her shoulder. The old school building smelled of chalk and fresh paper, and the low hum of children chatting filled the air. She had been teaching for over 20 years, but every morning still brought a new challenge. Today was no different. She glanced at her attendance sheet, sighing softly. One name, as always, stood out: Daniel Carter. Daniel had been missing more and more classes lately, and when he did show up, he sat in the back, quiet and distant. Mrs. Thompson had noticed the holes in his shoes, the way he tried to hide a torn notebook, and how he never brought lunch. She had seen this before. Children struggling silently while the world carried on, unaware. She knew Daniel's family was going through hard times. His mother worked 2 jobs, and his father had left years ago. School fees were just another impossible burden. That afternoon, as the bell rang and students rushed out, Mrs. Thompson called Daniel over. His shoulders tensed as he approached her desk, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Daniel," she said gently, "I need to talk to you." He swallowed hard. "Did I do something wrong?" She smiled. "Not at all. I just wanted to ask how things are at home." Daniel hesitated, then shrugged. "They're okay, I guess." But his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Thompson reached into her desk and pulled out an envelope. "I spoke to the principal," she said. "Your school fees, they're taken care of." His head snapped up. "What?" "You don't have to worry about them anymore," she said. "I covered them." Daniel stared at her, confusion and disbelief written all over his face. "But why would you do that?" "Because you deserve a chance, Daniel. You're smart, and I know you can do great things. Sometimes we all need a little help." Tears welled up in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, nodding. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know how to repay you." "You don't have to," she said warmly. "Just promise me one thing. Never give up on yourself." Years passed. The seasons changed. Students graduated and life moved on. Mrs. Thompson never saw Daniel again after he finished school. She often wondered what had become of him, hoping he had found his way. One evening, after a long day, she sat on her porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was filled with the distant laughter of children playing. Just as she was about to head inside, she heard a car pull up in front of her house. She frowned. Visitors were rare. Then came a knock on the door, a firm, deliberate knock. She hesitated before opening it, and when she did, her breath caught in her throat. Standing before her was a tall man in a crisp suit, his eyes filled with something unspoken, something deep and powerful. "Mrs. Thompson," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. She squinted, searching his face, until suddenly it clicked. It was Daniel, and the news he had come to share would change everything. For a moment, Mrs. Thompson couldn't find her voice. The young boy she had once known was now a grown man, standing tall with confidence. His once threadbare clothes were replaced by a tailored suit, his worn-out shoes now polished to perfection. But it was his eyes that struck her the most, still, filled with that same determination, but now carrying something more. A story. "Daniel?" she finally whispered, still in disbelief. A smile spread across his face. "It's been a long time." She nodded slowly, stepping aside. "Come in, please." He hesitated for a brief second before stepping through the doorway. The house hadn't changed much. Framed photos lined the walls. A soft lamp glowed in the corner, and the familiar scent of vanilla lingered in the air. It felt frozen in time, just as he remembered it from the few times she had invited students over after school. She led him to the living room, where he sat on the same old couch she had owned for decades. It creaked slightly under his weight, and he let out a quiet chuckle. "I can't believe I'm here," he admitted. Mrs. Thompson sat across from him, studying his face. "I can't believe it either," she said. You've changed." He exhaled deeply, as if carrying the weight of years in that single breath. "I have. And it's because of you." She tilted her head, confused. "What do you mean?" Daniel leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You probably don't even remember, but that day, the day you paid my school fees, it wasn't just money to me, it was hope. It was the first time someone looked at me and said, 'You matter.'" She blinked back the sudden sting in her eyes. "Daniel, He shook his head. "No, let me say this. That moment changed everything. You gave me a chance when no one else did. And I promised myself that I would make something of my life. That one day, I'd come back and tell you that you didn't waste your kindness on me." Mrs. Thompson's heart ached as she listened. She had spent her life pouring into her students, hoping that at least a few of them would go on to do something great. But hearing it like this, from him, was overwhelming. Daniel glanced around, taking in the small details of the house. The way the books were stacked neatly beside the armchair, the cup of tea still steaming on the side table. It was exactly how he had pictured it all these years. He had carried her memory with him, even when life tried to pull him in other directions. "There were so many times I wanted to give up," he admitted, his voice quieter now. "There were days when I thought I'd never get out of the life I was born into. But I kept thinking about you, about what you did for me, and I kept pushing forward." Mrs. Thompson reached out and placed a gentle hand over his. "I always knew you would." Daniel smiled, but there was something behind it, a shadow of the struggles he had endured. "I worked 3 jobs after school, studied at night. I barely slept, but I made it through college. Then I got an internship at a law firm, and now—" He let out a breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "Now I'm a lawyer." A tear slipped down Mrs. Thompson's cheek. "Daniel, I am so proud of you." He nodded, his own eyes glistening. "And I'm not just any lawyer. I specialize in cases for families like mine, kids like me. I fight for them because I know what it's like to feel invisible." She squeezed his hand, her heart full. "You've turned your pain into purpose." He chuckled softly. "I guess you could say that." There was a brief silence before he reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He set it on the table between them. Mrs. Thompson frowned. "What's this?" He exhaled slowly. "When I was a kid, you paid my school fees without expecting anything in return. But now, it's my turn." Her brows furrowed as she picked up the envelope and carefully opened it. The moment she saw what was inside, her hands trembled. A check. A sum far larger than anything she had ever held in her hands. Her breath hitched. "Daniel, I can't accept this." He met her gaze, his expression gentle yet firm. "You once told me that all I had to do to repay you was never give up on myself. I didn't. But now, I want to make sure you never have to struggle again." Mrs. Thompson shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "I never did it for money." "I know," he said softly. "That's why you deserve this more than anyone." Tears spilled freely now as she clutched the check in her hands. Unable to believe what was happening, the little boy she had once helped had returned. Not as the struggling child she had known, but as a man who had overcome impossible odds. A man who had never forgotten the kindness shown to him. And as she sat there, overwhelmed with gratitude, she realized that this was the true meaning of a full circle moment. But what she didn't know, what Daniel had yet to tell her, was that he wasn't just here to give her money. He had something else to say, something that would change both their lives forever. Mrs. Thompson wiped her tears. still overwhelmed by the check in her hands. But as she looked up at Daniel, she noticed something in his expression. Hesitation, as if he was holding something back. "What is it?" she asked gently. Daniel took a deep breath, his fingers tapping lightly on his knee. "There's more," he said. "I didn't just come here to thank you. I came because I need your help." Mrs. Thompson's heart tightened. "Of course, Daniel. Anything." He leaned forward, his voice steady, but filled with emotion. "There's a boy," he said. "His name is Marcus. He reminds me so much of myself when I was younger. Bright, full of potential, but trapped in a situation he can't control. His family is struggling, and I see the same hopelessness in his eyes that I used to feel." Mrs. Thompson listened intently, her grip tightening around the check. "I've been doing everything I can," Daniel continued. "I helped him get into a good school. I covered his expenses. But he needs something more. He needs someone who believes in him, someone who can guide him the way you guided me." She tilted her head, understanding dawning on her. "You want me to mentor him?" Daniel nodded. "Yes. I know you're retired now, but you changed my life, and I believe you could do the same for him." Mrs. Thompson stared at him for a long moment. After years of teaching, she had settled into a quiet life, telling herself that she had done her part. But now, looking at Daniel, she realized something. Her work wasn't finished. There was still more kindness to give, more lives to touch. A slow smile spread across her face. "I'd love to meet him." Daniel's shoulders relaxed with relief. "You won't regret it," he said. She reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You turned out to be an incredible man, Daniel. And now you're passing that kindness forward. That's the best gift you could ever give me." Daniel squeezed her hand. "I learned from the best." That evening, after Daniel left, Mrs. Thompson sat in the quiet of her home, staring at the check once more. But instead of thinking about what she could buy or how she could use it for herself, her mind drifted to Marcus, to the countless children out there who just needed someone to believe in them. And in that moment, she knew exactly what she would do. A week later, Daniel returned, with Marcus by his side. The boy was nervous at first, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, his eyes darting around uncertainly. But as Mrs. Thompson greeted him with her warm smile, he slowly relaxed. She saw something in him. Potential, resilience, the same quiet determination Daniel had once carried. As they sat together, talking, laughing, and sharing stories, Mrs. Thompson felt something stir inside her. A sense of purpose. A reminder that even the smallest act of kindness could ripple through time, shaping lives in ways she could never predict. Years ago, she had helped one boy without expecting anything in return, and now that boy had returned, not just to repay her, but to continue the cycle of kindness. And as she looked at Marcus, she knew one thing for certain: this was just the beginning of another life-changing journey.